Ever feel like you're playing checkers and everyone around you is playing chess? Like you're always a step behind.
Or maybe you're heading into a negotiation and it already feels like you're outmatched.
Exactly. We've all been there. But what if there was a way to seriously up your strategy game? To think 10 steps ahead no matter what you're doing.
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
We are taking a deep dive into The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
And trust me, this is not just for generals or military history buffs.
Not at all. It's a guide to strategy. And it is surprisingly relevant to everyday life, even thousands of years later.
It really is amazing how a text written over 2,500 years ago can still be so insightful and relevant for us today.
It's true.
And you know what's interesting about Sun Tzu's The Art of War is it's not actually about seeking out conflict.
Right.
It's about this idea of achieving your objectives through really careful strategic thinking, preparation, and really truly understanding the landscape you're operating in. And that includes your opponent, of course.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that famous quote, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. That's Sun Tzu, right?
Absolutely. And it's so true. And you know, while we might not be facing armies on a literal battlefield these days,
Right.
those principles of deeply knowing yourself and your competition, they are incredibly relevant, whether you're in the business world, in a negotiation, even in your personal relationships, believe it or not.
So true. So how do we actually put this ancient wisdom, this ancient knowledge into practice in our modern world? Because Sun Tzu, he lays out these 5 constant factors to consider in any kind of conflict, right? Moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline. And I have to admit, when I first read that, it sounded a little, well, ancient.
Right, it sounds like something you'd find on like a dusty scroll in an Indiana Jones movie, you know?
Exactly.
But when we actually unpack what Sun Tzu means by these factors, they're surprisingly relevant to how we approach all kinds of challenges even today.
Okay, so let's unpack. What's the deal with this moral law?
Well, Sun Tzu places a huge importance on this idea of moral law. And what he's really talking about is the importance of shared purpose.
Yeah.
That sense of everyone being completely aligned behind either a leader or a common mission.
Got it.
It's that feeling of unity, of trust, where everyone is working towards that same goal, you know?
Totally. That makes me think about company culture or even just the energy of a team when they're working on a project, you know? When everyone's on the same page and believes in what they're doing, it just feels different, right? There's this momentum.
Exactly. And Sun Tzu really recognized that this sense of unity, of shared commitment, it was like a massive force multiplier. I mean, he literally says, when one treats people with benevolence, justice, and righteousness, and reposes confidence in them, the army will be united in mind.
Wow. Okay. So if moral law is like the soul of a team or the driving force, how does that tie into these other factors he talks about, like heaven and earth? Because those seem very broad.
They do. But think of it this way. Heaven represents the things that are outside of your control. So that's things like the weather, timing, those external factors that can really impact any situation, right?
Okay.
Earth, on the other hand, that's your more concrete playing field. Think about terrain in a literal battle or in business. Maybe it's the market conditions, the competitive landscape, even just the resources that you have available.
So like you wouldn't launch a swimwear line in winter. Timing is part of heaven.
Exactly.
And earth is like making sure you've got your supply chains in order and knowing your competitors' strengths and weaknesses.
Precisely. You've got it. Sun Tzu's saying that you really have to be aware of both the internal and external forces that are at play in any situation.
So he's saying don't just focus on your own game plan, but you have to understand the entire playing field.
Exactly. And that awareness, that leads us to, I think, one of the most fascinating aspects of the art of war, and that's the element of deception.
Okay, see, this is where it gets really interesting to me because Sun Tzu literally says, and I'm quoting here, all warfare is based on deception. Now, I'm not saying we should be running around like deliberately misleading people, but how much of this is about strategically shaping perceptions?
Well, Sun Tzu is definitely, he's playing mind games here. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
But not necessarily in a malicious way. He argues that sometimes appearing weak when you're actually strong, or even appearing strong when you're weak, can give you a real strategic edge.
It's like in poker when you bluff with a terrible hand and your opponent folds thinking you have all the best cards.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about understanding how perception influences actions and how other people perceive you. And Sun Tzu, he really emphasizes that.
Right.
He says, and I'm quoting again here, if your opponent is of choleric temperament, seek to irritate him. It's about using psychology to your advantage.
Okay, so how do we walk that ethical line, right? Because I feel like there's a big difference between a strategic maneuver and straight up manipulation.
Oh, absolutely. And you're right to point that out. There is a huge difference. And this is where understanding the nuances of Sun Tzu's teachings, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Right.
Because he's not advocating for dishonesty, not at all.
Yeah.
What he's really advocating for is a deep understanding of how to use information strategically.
It's like the thing of knowledge is power, but it's how you wield that knowledge that determines if it's used for good or, well, not so good.
Exactly, exactly. And that's a conversation I think we definitely need to delve into a little bit further.
So we've talked about knowing the battlefield, but Sun Tzu takes that idea a step further, right?
Right.
He talks about this idea of winning without fighting.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating here is that Sun Tzu really believes that the most decisive victories, the best victories, are the ones that are achieved before a single blow is struck.
Okay, that's a power move right there.
It is.
But how do you actually make that happen? I mean, it sounds kind of mystical, you know?
Well, it's not about some sort of magic trick. It's about strategic maneuvering. It's not necessarily about physical confrontation. Imagine, like, dismantling your opponent's ability or even their will to engage with you
Oh, well,
at
I
the
mean,
first place.
I'm starting to see how this works outside of a military context.
Right, right.
That, like, in business, if you can, say, lock down the best suppliers or get the most talented people on your team,
Yeah.
secure those key patents before your competition even gets started, you basically already won.
Exactly. You've won before the game even begins.
Right.
You've got it. And, Sun Tzu gives some pretty compelling historical examples of this in action.
Okay, yeah. History lesson time. Hit me with an example.
Let's look at the Mongols under Genghis Khan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they were known for being incredibly fierce warriors,
Right.
but I think their real genius, their real strength was in their psychological warfare.
Interesting.
So before they would even engage in battle, they would send emissaries to their enemies, and they would present them with a choice:
Okay.
surrender and be spared, or resist and face utter destruction.
Oh, wow. So it's like a preemptive strike on their morale.
Exactly. The Mongols understood that breaking an enemy's spirit before the fight even began was often much more effective than any physical attack.
Wow.
And they created this aura of invincibility that often led to, their opponents surrendering without a fight.
It's making me rethink every negotiation I've ever been a part of.
Right.
What if, instead of going in, like, with my fists up, I found a way to disarm the other side,
Yeah.
to really try to understand their needs before they even have to say them out loud?
That's exactly the kind of thinking that Sun Tzu, I think, encourages.
Yeah.
He talks about this idea of subduing the enemy's will without fighting.
Right.
And you can do that through diplomacy, right?
Yeah.
Through finding strategic alliances, even through gestures of goodwill
Right.
that just make your opponent rethink their position.
So it sounds like a lot of this really comes down to empathy, which seems kind of counterintuitive when we're talking about strategy and competition, right?
Right. You're absolutely right. It's not something we usually think about when it comes to warfare.
Right.
But Sun Tzu was incredibly insightful when it came to human nature, and he argued that understanding your opponent's motivations, their fears, even their aspirations, was just as important as knowing how many troops they had or what resources they had available.
It's like that saying, before you judge someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes.
Right.
If you can understand their perspective, it's like you can anticipate their moves.
Absolutely.
And that just gives you a huge advantage.
It does. It does. And, that brings us back to Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing yourself.
Yes.
Because self-awareness is so crucial in all of this. It's about understanding your own strengths and weaknesses,
Okay.
your own tendencies, even your triggers,
Right.
so that you can make strategic decisions from a place of clarity, not from emotional reactivity.
Right. Not just in the heat of the moment. It makes sense. I can see how all of this would apply, like, in a high-stakes negotiation, but even just in a difficult conversation with, a family member or a loved one.
It applies everywhere.
If you know you have a tendency to, like, get defensive when you feel criticized, you can kind of, like, prepare for that.
Absolutely. You can have a
So
strategy.
the strategy for staying calm and focused on what really matters.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's such a perfect example, I think, of how Sun Tzu's wisdom really transcends just the battlefield, his insights into human behavior and strategic thinking, even the nature of conflict. It's surprisingly relevant to the challenges we all face in our modern lives.
It really is. It's making me wonder if sometimes our biggest battles aren't against, like, external enemies, but against our own internal resistance to change, or to growth, or to just stepping outside our comfort zones.
Oh, that's a really powerful insight, and one that I think Sun Tzu would very much appreciate. Because he recognized that true victory, it often lies in conquering our own limitations, conquering our fears, and even our own preconceived notions.
Like that quote, the greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Wait, that wasn't Sun Tzu.
No.
That was Nelson Mandela.
Right. Different continent, different century, but
Same idea.
same spirit of resilience and self-mastery.
Yes, exactly. It's all about that inner game, isn't it? That ability to adapt and to learn from our mistakes
Yeah.
and to just keep striving for something greater than ourselves. You know, it's funny, we started this deep dive talking about ancient military strategy,
Right.
but it really feels like we've stumbled onto this like blueprint
Yeah.
for navigating just about any of life's challenges.
It's true. That's the beauty of Sun Tzu's work, I think. It's not just about, winning wars in a traditional sense.
Right.
It's about understanding these underlying principles of conflict and strategy and human nature that
Yeah.
I think really are relevant in just about every aspect of life.
Totally. It's like he's saying, hey, life is going to throw you some curveballs.
It will.
Here's how you develop your own inner game to handle them.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful tools, I think, that he gives us in the art of war is this real emphasis on preparation and foresight. Remember that quote we mentioned earlier, every battle is won or lost before it's ever fought.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like that saying in sports, practice doesn't make perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect practice makes perfect. You have to like put in the work beforehand
Right.
and anticipate the challenges, Have a game plan ready.
Yes, precisely. Sun Tzu really believed that true victory is often determined, like you're saying, long before any actual confrontation takes place.
Yeah.
It's about meticulous planning, gathering intelligence, positioning yourself strategically.
Being proactive instead of reactive.
Yes.
All right.
Instead of waiting for things to just happen to you,
Right.
you're actively shaping the situation to your advantage.
Totally.
And this applies to everything from like negotiating a business deal to having a difficult conversation with a loved one.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
If you can try to anticipate those potential roadblocks,
Right.
if you can understand the other person's perspective, if you have a really clear sense of your own goals walking into that situation, you are just so much more likely to actually achieve a positive outcome.
Yeah. It makes me think about like how many arguments could just be avoided
Right.
if we all just took a second to understand like where the other person was coming from.
Absolutely.
Try to find that common ground before things escalate.
Right. It's a really powerful concept.
It is.
And I think it speaks to the heart of Sun Tzu's philosophy, He wasn't just a military strategist.
Right.
He was a really deep thinker who understood the complexities of human interaction, and he recognized that true strength lies not in just brute force, but in wisdom and empathy and a real commitment to seeking solutions that actually benefit everyone involved.
It's such a timely message,
Yeah.
even though it's coming from centuries ago.
It's incredible, really. And I think they are a really timeless reminder that victory, in its truest sense, it is about achieving our goals, of course, but it's
Yep.
about doing it in a way that preserves relationships,
Right.
that we're acting with integrity,
Right.
and that we are always, always striving to learn and grow from our experiences.
It's about playing the long game, Not just winning whatever's right in front of you, but actually creating a future where everybody can thrive.
Yes, well said. That's a great way to put it. I think that's something we can all take to heart, no matter what we're facing in our own lives.
Absolutely. So the next time you're feeling stuck or you're facing a challenge that just seems impossible,
Right.
remember Sun Tzu's wisdom. Know yourself, understand your opponent, and prepare the field for that outcome that you want.
Because just like Sun Tzu taught us, every victory is won or lost long before the battle even begins.
And that is our deep dive for today. We hope you've walked away with some new insights, some strategies to navigate the maybe sometimes murky waters of life, both on and off the battlefield.
Yep.
Until next time, stay curious out there.